There is a single invention that you have probably never thought about, and yet without it, every empire you have ever studied in a history book would have collapsed. Not bronze, not gunpowder, not even the wheel. Paper. A sheet so thin you can tear it with 2 fingers, and yet it held together civilizations spanning millions of square miles and hundreds of millions of people. Before paper, governing a large territory was like trying to remember a dream. The details slipped away. Orders were lost. Laws were forgotten. Tax records crumbled into dust. And then one day, in a workshop in ancient China, someone figured out how to turn plant fibers into a flat, portable, writable surface, and the entire trajectory of human civilization bent in a new direction. This is the story of how that happened, and why it matters far more than you were ever taught. To understand what paper changed, you first need to understand what came before it. And what came before it was, frankly, a mess. The earliest known writing surfaces were clay tablets, used in ancient Mesopotamia, starting around 3300 BCE. The Sumerians would take a lump of wet clay, flatten it, press a reed stylus into the surface to form wedge-shaped marks, and then let the tablet dry in the sun or bake it in a kiln. These tablets were remarkably durable. Thousands of them have survived to the present day, but they were also heavy, bulky, and extremely impractical for anything beyond short records. A single clay tablet might weigh a pound or more. Imagine trying to run an empire when every letter, every tax receipt, every legal contract weighs as much as a small brick. You would need warehouses just to store a year of government correspondence, and the Sumerians did exactly that. They built entire rooms dedicated to storing tablets, and they employed scribes whose sole job was to organize and retrieve them. The Egyptians had a somewhat better solution. Around 3000 BCE, they began producing papyrus, a writing material made from the pith of the papyrus plant that grew along the banks of the Nile. Workers would slice the pith into thin strips, lay them side by side in 2 perpendicular layers, moisten them, press them together, and let them dry under weight. The result was a smooth, flexible sheet that could be written on with reed pens and ink. Papyrus was a genuine leap forward. It was lighter than clay, it could be rolled into scrolls for storage and transport, and it enabled the Egyptian bureaucracy to function at a level of sophistication that the ancient world had never seen. The famous Library of Alexandria, which at its peak may have held as many as 400,000 scrolls, was built entirely on papyrus. But papyrus had serious limitations. First, it could only be produced from a single plant species that grew almost exclusively in the Nile Delta. This made Egypt a monopoly supplier, and it meant that any civilization that wanted to use papyrus had to either trade with Egypt or go without. Second, papyrus was fragile in humid conditions. It lasted well in the dry heat of Egypt, but in the damp climates of Northern Europe or Eastern Asia, it rotted quickly. Third, it was expensive. Producing high-quality papyrus required skilled labor and careful processing, which meant that only governments, temples, and the wealthy could afford to use it in any significant quantity. There were other writing surfaces too. The Greeks and Romans used wax tablets for everyday notes, scratching letters into a thin layer of beeswax spread over a wooden board. Parchment, made from the treated skins of sheep, goats, or calves, emerged around the 2nd century BCE and was far more durable than papyrus. But parchment was extraordinarily expensive. Producing a single large book on parchment might require the skins of 200 or more animals. One estimate suggests that the entire output of a medieval scriptorium over the course of a year consumed the hides of thousands of sheep. This was a writing surface for the elite, not for a functioning bureaucracy. And so for thousands of years, every civilization that wanted to keep records, pass laws, collect taxes, and communicate across distances was constrained by the physical limitations of whatever writing surface it happened to use. Governing was expensive. Information was scarce. Knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a tiny literate class. The world was waiting for something better. It just did not know it yet. The breakthrough came in China, and the traditional story centers on a man named Kai Lun, According to the official Chinese historical text known as the Book of the Later Han, Cai Lun was a court official serving the Emperor He of the Han dynasty. Around the year 105 CE, Cai Lun presented the emperor with a new material. He had taken bark from mulberry trees, scraps of hemp and old rags, and fishnets, soaked them in water, pounded them into a pulp, spread the pulp over a flat woven screen, and allowed it to dry. The result was a thin, smooth, flexible sheet that could absorb ink beautifully. The emperor was reportedly so impressed that he ordered this new material to be adopted throughout the court. Now, modern archaeology has complicated this origin story somewhat. Fragments of what appear to be true paper have been found in Chinese tombs dating to the 2nd century BCE, roughly 200 years before Cai Lun. So Cai Lun may not have invented paper so much as perfected an existing process and promoted its use at the imperial level. But regardless of who deserves the original credit, the key point remains the same. By the early 2nd century CE, China had a standardized, scalable process for producing a cheap, lightweight, versatile writing surface. And this changed everything. The impact on Chinese governance was immediate and profound. The Han dynasty already had an elaborate bureaucratic system, but it had been constrained by the cost and limitations of bamboo strips and silk, which were the primary writing surfaces before paper. Bamboo was cheap, but bulky. A single book written on bamboo strips might fill an entire cart. Silk was light and smooth, but ruinously expensive. Paper eliminated both problems at once. It was cheap enough to use for everyday correspondence, light enough to carry in bundles, and smooth enough for detailed writing and record keeping. Within a few generations of paper's widespread adoption, the Chinese bureaucracy expanded dramatically. Government offices multiplied. Record keeping became more detailed and systematic. Census data, tax rolls, military rosters, legal codes, and imperial edicts could all be produced, copied, and distributed at a scale that had never been possible before. Paper did not just support the Chinese state. It enabled the Chinese state to become something fundamentally new, a government that could track individual citizens, collect taxes with precision, deploy armies based on detailed logistical records, and enforce laws uniformly across vast distances. And paper did something else too. It democratized knowledge, slowly but relentlessly. Before paper, books in China were objects of extreme luxury, hand-copied on silk by professional scribes and accessible only to the aristocracy. Paper brought the cost of a book down dramatically. This did not create universal literacy overnight, far from it. But it did allow a much larger class of scholars, officials, and merchants to own written texts. The famous Chinese civil service examination system, which selected government officials through competitive written tests, would have been utterly impossible without cheap paper. You cannot run a meritocratic bureaucracy when only the wealthiest families can afford the materials needed to study. For centuries, paper remained a Chinese secret. The technique spread gradually to neighboring regions, reaching Korea and Japan by the 6th and 7th centuries. But the wider world, including the vast and powerful Islamic Caliphate and medieval Europe, remained ignorant of the process. That changed because of a single battle, and it is one of the most consequential military engagements you have probably never heard of. In 751 CE, near the Talas River in what is now modern-day Kyrgyzstan, the armies of the Chinese Tang dynasty clashed with the forces of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Battle of Talas was not a particularly large engagement by the standards of either empire, and its immediate military consequences were modest. The Tang forces lost, but the Abbasid Caliphate did not follow up with any serious territorial expansion into Chinese lands. What mattered about Talas was what happened after the fighting stopped. Among the Chinese soldiers captured by the Abbasid forces were skilled papermakers. These prisoners were brought to the city of Samarkand, which was already a major commercial hub on the Silk Road, and there they were put to work. Within years, Samarkand had its own thriving paper industry. The impact on the Islamic world was transformative. Paper reached Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, by the late 8th century. By the early 9th century, Paper mills were operating across the Islamic world, from Egypt to Spain, and the timing could not have been more perfect. The 8th through 13th centuries were the period of the Islamic Golden Age, an era of extraordinary intellectual achievement in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, chemistry, and literature. Paper was the infrastructure that made this explosion of knowledge possible. Consider the scale. The great libraries of the Islamic world dwarfed anything that had existed in Europe at the time. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, employed translators who rendered Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic, creating a vast repository of human knowledge. The Library of Cordoba in Muslim Spain reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes. These institutions were only possible because paper was cheap enough and abundant enough to support the production of books on a massive scale. Paper also reshaped the economics of learning in the Islamic world. Books became affordable enough that private book collections became common among the educated class. Scholars could own personal libraries of hundreds of volumes, something unimaginable in a parchment-based culture. A thriving book trade emerged, with professional booksellers and copyists operating in every major city. The Arabic word for bookseller, warak, became a common occupation. And paper transformed Islamic governance in the same way it had transformed Chinese governance centuries earlier. The Abbasid Caliphate was an enormous political entity, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. Administering such a territory required constant communication, detailed record-keeping, and standardized legal documentation. Paper made all of this feasible. Tax records, land surveys, judicial rulings, diplomatic correspondence, and religious edicts could be produced and circulated efficiently. The Arabic word for a government office, diwan, originally referred to a register or record book, a reminder that Islamic administration was built on written paper records from the very beginning. Europe, meanwhile, was still using parchment, and this mattered enormously. While the Islamic world was building vast libraries and running sophisticated bureaucracies on paper, medieval Europe was copying books one at a time on animal skins, at enormous cost. In monasteries where literacy was confined to a small religious elite, a single copy of the Bible on parchment might take a scribe a year or more to complete and require the skins of hundreds of animals. Books were so expensive that they were sometimes chained to library desks to prevent theft. In this environment, knowledge spread slowly, education was rare, and governance was crude and localized. Feudal Europe was not primitive because Europeans were unintelligent. It was primitive in large part because Europeans did not have paper. Paper finally arrived in Europe through the Islamic territories on the Iberian Peninsula and through trade with the broader Islamic world. The first European paper mill was established in the town of Zátiva, in what is now Spain, around the year 1060. But adoption was slow at first. European elites were suspicious of paper. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, actually issued a decree in 1221, forbidding the use of paper for official documents, insisting on parchment instead. Paper was seen as flimsy, impermanent, and associated with the Islamic world, which did not help its reputation in Christendom. But economics eventually won out over prejudice. Paper was simply too cheap and too useful to ignore. Paper mills spread to Italy in the 13th century, particularly in the towns of Fabriano and Amalfi, where Italian craftsmen improved the manufacturing process by introducing water-powered stamping mills and gelatin sizing, which made the paper smoother and more durable. From Italy, the technology moved to France, Germany, and eventually to England and the rest of the continent. But Europe did something with paper that nobody else had done before. It combined paper with a revolutionary new technology, the movable type printing press. In the 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz in modern-day Germany, developed a system for casting individual metal letter blocks that could be arranged into pages, inked, and pressed onto paper to produce multiple identical copies of a text. The printing press itself was not entirely new. The Chinese had developed woodblock printing centuries earlier, and the Koreans had experimented with movable metal type as early as the 13th century. But Gutenberg's system was uniquely suited to the European context. The Latin alphabet, with its relatively small number of characters, made movable type far more practical than it was for the thousands of characters in the Chinese writing system. The combination of cheap paper and the printing press created an information revolution that is difficult to overstate. Before Gutenberg, producing a single copy of a book was a labor of weeks or months. After Gutenberg, a printer could produce hundreds of identical copies in a matter of days. The cost of books plummeted. The number of books in circulation exploded. Estimates suggest that by the year 1500, just 50 years after Gutenberg printed his first Bible, there were already some 20 million printed volumes in circulation across Europe. By 1600, that number had risen to roughly 200 million. This flood of printed paper reshaped European civilization from top to bottom. The Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, succeeded in large part because Luther's ideas could be printed on paper pamphlets and distributed across Germany in a matter of weeks. Previous reform movements within the Catholic Church had fizzled because they could not spread fast enough to build a critical mass of support. Luther had paper and the printing press, and that made all the difference. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was equally dependent on paper. Scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton could publish their findings in printed books and journals, allowing other researchers to read, critique, replicate, and build upon their work. Science, as a collective enterprise, where knowledge accumulates through the contributions of many individuals, simply cannot function without a cheap and efficient medium for recording and sharing information. Paper was that medium. And then there was governance. The rise of the modern nation-state in the 16th through 19th centuries was fundamentally a story about paper. As kingdoms consolidated into centralized states, they needed to do things that feudal kingdoms had never done. They needed to conduct detailed censuses, tracking every citizen by name, age, occupation, and location. They needed to create comprehensive legal codes that applied uniformly across their territory. They needed to issue standardized currency, passports, land titles, and contracts. They needed to run standing armies with complex supply chains, pay records, and operational orders. They needed to collect taxes systematically, which required detailed financial records and a trained bureaucracy to manage them. All of this required paper, mountains of paper. And the states that mastered the art of paper-based administration gained an enormous advantage over those that did not. The Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the French colonial administration, the Prussian military bureaucracy, all of these were, at their core, paper empires. They governed through written orders, printed laws, filed reports, and archived records. The famous phrase, "The pen is mightier than the sword," is not a poetic metaphor. It is a literal statement about how power actually works. The sword conquers territory, but it is the pen, moving across paper, that governs it. Without paper, conquest is temporary. With paper, conquest becomes administration, and administration becomes lasting control. Consider the British Empire at its height in the 19th century. It administered territories on every continent, encompassing roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and a quarter of its population. How did a small island nation manage this? Through an extraordinary system of paper-based communication and record-keeping. Every colonial administrator filed regular reports to London. Every tax collection was documented. Every law was printed and distributed. Every military deployment was recorded. The British civil service, often mocked for its bureaucratic tendencies, was in fact one of the most sophisticated information management systems the world had ever seen, and it ran on paper. The American Revolution itself was a paper event. The Declaration of Independence was a paper document. The Constitution was a paper document. The Federalist Papers, the series of essays that argued for ratification of the Constitution, were printed in newspapers on paper. The entire structure of American democracy, with its written laws, printed ballots, court records, and government filings is fundamentally a paper-based system. The Founding Fathers did not just create a new government, they created a new government made of paper. The French Revolution told a similar story. Pamphlets, newspapers, printed manifestos, and government decrees were the fuel that drove the revolution forward. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was printed and distributed across France. Revolutionary committees kept meticulous written records of their proceedings, their arrests, and their executions. For better and for worse, paper made the revolution possible. By the 19th century, the industrialization of paper production removed the last remaining constraints on its availability. Earlier paper had been made by hand, one sheet at a time, from cotton and linen rags. In 1799, a French inventor named Louis-Nicolas Robert patented the first continuous paper-making machine. This machine, later refined by the Fordrinier brothers in England, could produce a continuous roll of paper at speeds that hand production could never match. Then, in the 1840s and 1850s, new processes were developed for making paper from wood pulp rather than rags. Since wood was vastly cheaper and more abundant than cotton or linen scraps, this innovation made paper so inexpensive that it became truly disposable. Newspapers could be printed by the millions and sold for a penny. Government forms could be produced and distributed to every citizen. Businesses could keep records of every transaction, no matter how small. The bureaucratic state of the late 19th and 20th centuries was built on this ocean of cheap paper. Income tax returns, social security records, military draft registrations, immigration documents, driver licenses, insurance policies, medical records, educational transcripts, all of these are paper technologies. They are systems for recording, organizing, and retrieving information about individual human beings, and they are what allow modern governments to function. When political scientists talk about state capacity, the ability of a government to actually carry out its policies and enforce its laws, they are essentially talking about the quality of a state's paper-based information systems. States with strong bureaucracies have high state capacity. States with weak or corrupt bureaucracies have low state capacity. And the foundation of every bureaucracy, going all the way back to ancient China, is paper. There is a profound irony in the fact that we now live in what is sometimes called the digital age. And yet paper has not gone away. Global paper production actually continued to increase well into the 21st century. Offices still print documents. Courts still file paper records. Governments still issue paper currency, paper passports, and paper tax forms. Books are still printed on paper. Contracts are still signed on paper. The paperless office that futurists predicted in the 1970s never materialized. In many ways, digital technology has actually increased the demand for paper because computers make it so easy to create documents that people end up printing more, not less. But beyond the simple persistence of paper as a physical object, the deeper point is that the conceptual framework paper created still governs our world. Our entire information architecture, the way we think about documents, records, files, pages, and forms, was developed for paper and then translated into digital systems. When you open a file on your computer, you are using a metaphor borrowed from paper filing systems. When you scroll through a page on a website, you are referencing a unit of information that was defined by the physical dimensions of a paper sheet. When a government database stores your information, it is doing digitally what paper clerks did manually for centuries, organizing individual records into retrievable systems. The story of paper is, in the end, a story about the relationship between information and power. Every major shift in the history of governance can be traced back to a change in information technology. Clay tablets enabled the first city-states. Papyrus enabled the Egyptian and Roman bureaucracies. Paper enabled the Chinese imperial examination system, the Islamic Golden Age, the European printing revolution, the rise of the nation-state, and the creation of modern democracy. Each of these transformations happened because a new medium made it possible to record, store, copy, and distribute information more cheaply and efficiently than before. And here is the thing that most people miss. These were not just technical changes, they were political changes. When information becomes cheaper, more people can access it. When more people can access information, power becomes harder to monopolize. The Chinese examination system opened government service to talented commoners. The printing press broke the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious interpretation. Printed newspapers created an informed public that could hold governments accountable. Each expansion of information access was resisted by the people who benefited from information scarcity. And each time, the new technology eventually won. Paper did not just make empires governable, it made empires accountable. It created the possibility of laws that were written down and could be consulted by anyone, rather than laws that existed only in the memory of a king or priest. It created the possibility of financial records that could be audited, rather than tax collection based on arbitrary demands. It created the possibility of a public sphere, where citizens could read the same newspapers, discuss the same ideas, and form shared opinions about how they should be governed. The next time you hold a piece of paper in your hands, consider what you are actually holding. You are holding a technology that is almost 2,000 years old. A technology that was born in China, traveled along the Silk Road, was captured in battle by an Arab army, fueled an Islamic golden age, arrived in Europe just in time to meet the printing press, powered the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the rise of democracy, and the creation of every modern institution you interact with on a daily basis. It weighs almost nothing. It costs almost nothing. And it built the world you live in. If this story surprised you, or if it made you think about paper differently, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a like so more people can find this video. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of the history of paper you found most fascinating. I would love to hear your thoughts.